Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Becky Van Horn. I am your Carbon County Preservation Officer. Tonight we have a special speaker. Robert Schalla has done us innumerable favors in the past couple of years, coming in and presenting his book and his research, Black Diamonds. If you are interested in that book, after the talk, you can go over to our gift shop. He was gracious enough to bring us some this evening, and he will be doing book signings as well. So the way that tonight will go is essentially Robert will give the talk about Black Diamonds, and then this evening, after the talk, we'll go over to Bear Creek. If you can carpool, that would be best, just because some of the spaces get a little tight. Otherwise, feel free to bring your own transportation, water, hat, bug spray. I got some in my car if anybody needs it. And before we start kicking off tonight, I just want to let you guys all know, this counts as our August field trip, so I decided to do another event as well. Heart Mountain will be here as our next presentation, August 28th at 5 p.m., so you can learn about the Japanese Internment Center over basically over by Powell. Ura Sundala is a 6th generation Wyomingite, and her family was interned at Heart Mountain. So the next thing, I'm sure some of you may have seen this already all over Facebook, is the Montana Cowgirl Showdown. This is a all-female talent competition in youth and adult categories in country music, poetry, dance, and cowgirl fashion. And this event is a fundraiser for the museum, but we have a really exciting twist this year. The winner of our country music competition will go on as a finalist in Montana's Got Talent. So very cool, very exciting. Noreen Linderman will be there playing some music, as well as Robin Halliday-Quist. So if you're interested in that information, please pick up some of these flyers on your way out. And then if you're losing track, like I do all the time, please grab one of these upcoming events flyers by the front door. I tape mine to my fridge and check them off as I go along. So that is all I have for you guys this evening. And let me present my friend, Mr. Robert Schalla.
Thanks, Becky. Is the microphone working? I think I turned it on.
Turn it on.
Turn it on. Oh, yeah. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate the interest. A chance to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the railroads here in Carbon County and the history behind railroad development. One of the reviewers in my book said that it was a story about starry-eyed visionaries and hard-headed railroaders. And I think that sums it up pretty well. I'm going to introduce you to a whole bunch of different people, and I hope you can keep track of all the personalities. I got a lot of material to cover in the next hour, and so I'm going to breeze through it pretty quickly. Hopefully I'll stay on schedule, and we'll just see where it goes from there. First slide. So I'd like to start the talk with this guy. This is Yankee Jim George. He was born in Vermont and grew up in Iowa, and at the age of 16 he headed west. It said on the toe of his father's boot. But we don't know much about Yankee Jim, his early years, except that by the time he was in his mid-20s, he made his way to Montana. And it was in 1866 he joined a gold prospecting expedition that started in Bozeman and was going to work its way along the Beartooth Front, looking for gold. And Yankee Jim is the guy that's generally credited with finding the coal field here at the Red Lodge and over the hill in Bear Creek. This has been disputed. I gave a talk a few weeks ago where one of the participants, the audience, told me that wasn't true, that some people knew about the coal here before Yankee Jim. But I don't know if that's true or not. What I do know is that Yankee Jim was the first guy to stake a claim on the coal here, so he certainly gets credit for that much anyway. So what was it that Yankee Jim found? Well, pardon me, but I'm a geologist. We're going to have to take a deep dive into geology here for just a minute. So the next slide. The coal here at Red Lodge and Bear Creek was formed about 60 million years ago. It's in a geological formation called the Fort Union. If you look at this, what we call a stratigraphic section, you're looking at yellow layers of sandstone and brown layers of shale, and the black stripes are the coal beds. And there are 9 separate mineable coal beds here in the Bear Creek Red Lodge coal field. They're spread out over 825 feet and total about 60 feet of total coal in that interval. They were originally numbered 1 through 7, starting at the top, and when they went back and realized they'd missed 2 of the coal beds, they numbered those 1.5 and 4.5 just to keep the other number sequence right. Most of the coal that was mined here came out of beds 1, 3, and 4, although virtually all the coal beds were mined to some extent in various places. The interesting thing is that the U.S. Geological Survey estimated that there was over 1 billion tons of recoverable coal here in this coal field, so it's a pretty significant resource. Next slide. So what about the coal? Coal forms in swamps. It's trees and ferns and all kinds of plant matter that falls down into the bottom of stinky swamp water, and eventually when the swamp dries up, it's a material called peat, which you see at the bottom here, and peat burns. They burn it in Ireland, use it for heating, but when the peat gets buried under rock layers, it starts getting transformed into coal, and the first coal that gets formed as it gets buried is called lignite. And as it gets buried deeper and deeper and squeezed tighter and tighter, it turns into subbituminous and then bituminous, and finally you may have heard of anthracite, which is hard, very hard coal. So these are the different types of coal. And again, this shows that as you go from peat to anthracite, and you're going from soft to hard, you're going from low heat value up to high heat value as you go through these types. Then at the same time, you're going from low moisture in anthracite to very high moisture content in peat. So that's what's happening. And the coal we have here at Red Lodge kind of straddles the zone between subbituminous and bituminous coal in this area here. Some of the coal would be, just along the borderline, but you can see that it contains about 1,150 BTUs of heat value per pound of coal. To compare it to some other coal in Montana, there's a coal field near Livingston, Bozeman, and also the same coal occurs near here in Fromberg and Bridger, and this coal is a little bit better. It's bituminous coal, has a heat value around 13,000, and then you may have heard of the coal mine that's currently in operation at Coal Strip, and that's subbituminous coal over there, and you can see the heat content is a fair bit lower. So anyway, Yankee Jim found some good coal and a lot of it. Next slide. A few years after Yankee Jim made his discovery, this guy and a couple of his partners were up in the mountains near what would be Yellowstone National Park, and they stumbled into a pretty significant gold deposit up there. It would later be called the New World Mining District, and a town called Cooke City would develop in that area. So old Horn Miller here, he was the guy that found the gold that Yankee Jim had been set out looking for. Next slide. So what about that gold? Here's a geological map, and all this shows is the type of rocks that are exposed to the surface. Here's Cooke City, and you can see how long a mile is, and you get a sense of the area that this map covers. Horn Miller made his initial discovery here on Miller Mountain, mostly lead and silver that he found. Next slide. There's more gold, silver, and copper over at Henderson Mountain. Next slide. Then down to the south at Republic Mountain, lead, silver, and zinc. And then finally, one more slide. And way up to the north, they found a high-grade copper deposit with silver and even platinum in it. So the New World Mining District was pretty significant. I mean, it covers a huge area, and a lot of different minerals contained there. Next slide. So just to put that in perspective, how good is this stuff? Well, a sample from Fisher Mountain in the main area, this is 0.189 ounces per ton is what that means, OPT. It had, almost 0.2 of an ounce of gold in it, an ounce per ton of silver, and 0.25% copper. But it got better from there. Henderson Mountain, almost 0.4 of an ounce of gold per ton, an ounce and a half of silver, almost 1% copper. When a company called Crown Butte Mines came in here in the 1990s to evaluate this deposit, they were drilling core holes, and they had one core hole where they intercepted 94 feet that averaged about 0.5 ounce of gold per ton, and 0.7 copper, 0.7%. They had another intercept of over 50 feet where they actually had an ounce per ton of gold and 1% copper. This is good stuff. If you're familiar with the big pit up at Butte, right now they're mining rock that's 0.6% copper, and that's considered pretty good ore over in Butte. So the stuff up at Cooke City was good, and people were interested in it. Next slide. So here's the setup. Here's the way things looked in the 1870s. The problem was, you can see where Red Lodge and the coal field is here, and Cooke City, and gold and silver that they found up there. And the problem was that the Laramie Treaty of 1868 had given all of this shaded land here to the Crow tribe as their reservation. And so these two areas were well within the tribal lands of the Crow tribe. So Red Lodge couldn't be developed, but it didn't stop guys with picks and shovels from going up to the Cooke City area and digging holes in the ground. And that didn't make the Crow tribal people very happy to have these guys trespassing on their land. The government knew there was going to be trouble if that continued, so the federal government started negotiating with the Crow tribe in 1880, and in 1882 they got the Crow to agree to release about 1.5 million acres from their reservation. Next slide. So all of this got pulled out of the reservation, and you can see obviously that what they call the Crow Cession of 1882 was designed to get Cooke City and Red Lodge out of reservation land, and also kind of resolve any border conflicts there might be with Yellowstone National Park, which had just been formed. The other thing that happened right at about that time, 1882, was that the Northern Pacific Railroad was built up the Yellowstone Valley, and I'll be showing you this map again over and over. So just to kind of orient you, Billings is right up here, Bozeman on this side, you can see Big Timber, and of course the state line, and the park here. So in 1882 and 83, the Northern Pacific Railroad came through and built its way up to Yellowstone, and in 1883, after that had been finished, one of the first branches they built off of that railroad started in Livingston and went down to a place called Cinnabar, which is just north of where Gardner is now. And this was there wasn't much else for a railroad out here at that time, so hauling tourists to and from the national park would be an important source of revenue for them. So this first branch line that they built was important as far as making the railroad profitable. Well, as soon as they got that line finished at Cinnabar, they started thinking about, well, what can we do to get to Cooke City? Next slide. And what they came up with was the Northern Pacific Railroad set up a subsidiary company called the Cinnabar and Cooke City Railroad. And they were going to build a line from Cinnabar and run it right through Yellowstone National Park to get to Cooke City. Well, it turns out, it may come as a surprise, but there was a pretty strong environmental movement back even in the 1800s, 1880s. And the idea of letting a company build a railroad through a national park didn't sit well with a lot of folks. And the Northern Pacific ran into pretty fierce opposition to this proposal. And within 2 or 3 years, they had pretty much given up on the idea of ever being allowed to build a railroad through the national park. But other people saw the potential at Cooke City and in Red Lodge, and one of the first guys to recognize that was a guy named Phillip Gallaher. He was a civil engineer, and he got together with some backers in the east and some other Montana folks, and they put together a company called the Billings, Clarks Fork, and Cooke City Railroad. Next slide. And what they were going to do was start the railroad in Billings up here, and then just follow the Clarks Fork River across the Crow Reservation, and then up through the mountains following the Clarks Fork, and get to Cooke City that way. Next slide. Along the way, they were going to build a branch line that was going to start near the town of Edgar, up in here, and then go over the hill and get to the coal field at Red Lodge. That was proposed in 1886. That same year, next slide, another railroad was proposed by another group here in Montana. They were going to start in Laurel and follow Rock Creek into Red Lodge. Next slide. And then they were going to build a line along the mountain front and follow the Stillwater River up to Cooke City. And this was called the Rocky Fork and Cooke City Railroad. And then finally, next slide, there was still another group that came in and said, well, we're going to build a railroad from Columbus through Nye and up to Cooke City. So there were a whole bunch of people with the idea that they could build a railroad and get something done and develop the ore deposits of Cooke City and the coal field at Red Lodge. Of all these proposals, only one of them got built. Next slide. And that ended up being the Rocky Fork and Cooke City Railroad, which the guys that started in Laurel. They finished the line that came down here to Red Lodge in February of 1889. They still talked about extending the line up to Nye and down to Cooke City, but everybody knew that pretty much all they were really interested in was hauling the coal out of Red Lodge, so nobody really took them too seriously. Well, the main thing that this did, Phil Gallaher and his group that were going to build the railroad that followed the Clarks Fork all the way up to Cooke City, well, his partners all got cold feet after this line got finished, and they kind of bailed out on him. Next slide. So this is Phil, sharp-looking guy. He was determined to see that railroad built to Cooke City. And so in 1889, after his first group of partners gave up on the idea, Phil went out to look for somebody else to back his idea of a railroad up through the mountains. And,
did he ever live around here, or was this an operation from a distance?
he did. He lived in Billings at this time. Yeah, he had grown up in Pennsylvania, got his engineering degree there, and then had come out west working on railroads and stuff. Initially, he opened up an office in Helena, and then eventually moved to Billings, probably around 1886 when this proposal was made. So he's looking for a new partner, and next slide. And the guy that he found was this guy. This is Elijah Smith, and we'll be talking about him a little bit. Elijah was a Boston capitalist, had access to a lot of money. He was into a lot of different businesses, coal mining and railroads and timber and all sorts of other stuff. He was an associate of a guy named Henry Villard, and we'll talk about Henry a little bit later in this talk. But Elijah was involved in all sorts of operations, and I'll get into that a little more. But in 1889, he partnered up with Phil Gallaher, and they were going to come up with a new scheme for a railroad. Next slide. They, in 1889, they incorporated a company called the Montana and Wyoming Railroad Company, and that was basically a remake of Gallaher's original railroad, the Billings, Clarks Fork, and Cooke City. Along with that, though, they went into the Bear Creek Valley and started buying up coal land, and they eventually controlled about 3,000 acres of some of the prime coal properties in the Bear Creek Valley. And they put those all under the control of a company called the Montana Coal and Iron Company. So these two companies were formed in 1889 with the idea of developing the coal resources at Bear Creek and building a railroad to get them out. Next slide. So what did that look like? Next slide. So here was their plan. Again, this looks familiar. They were going to start in Billings, run the line down to Cooke City. Next slide. And then they were going to build a little branch line up into the Bear Creek Valley to get the coal out. So this was their plan for the Montana and Wyoming and the Montana Coal and Iron Company. Well, they had a problem. The problem was that you can see here that much of the railroad ran across the Crow Indian Reservation. And in order to get permission, you had to get permission from the tribe to build a railroad across tribal land. Now, the folks that built the Rocky Fork and Cooke City line into Red Lodge had gotten that permission from the tribe. They had paid the tribe $2 an acre for the right-of-way land that they took, and they also guaranteed that any tribal member who wanted to ride on their train from Red Lodge could do it for free. They just had to ride on the outside of the cars. So apparently in the early years, freight trains were often decorated with natives sitting on the top of boxcars and stuff, getting their free transit. But having done that, when Gallaher and Elijah Smith came to the Crow tribe and said, we need a right-of-way across your reservation, they said, no, we've got a railroad, and we don't want two of them on the reservation land. So in 1889, 1890, that kind of stopped this whole plan. Well, around 1890, Gallaher and Smith became aware that the federal government was once again negotiating with tribal members to give up more of their reservation land. And so they were holding out hope, and in October of 1892, a treaty was ratified by Congress, and the Crow tribe agreed to let go of another 1.8 million acres of their reservation that they were given. And what that did was it removed essentially all of this land, pushed the reservation boundary back to the east to about where it is today. So that opened this area up. They didn't have to negotiate with the tribe anymore to build their railroad, and it looked like things were going to roll ahead. But in February of 1893, the stock market crashed. There was a thing called the Panic of 1893, and banks failed, and money to build railroads dried up. And so the plans for this railroad went down the drain. Well, the other thing that happened with the Crow Session of 1892 was in opening up all this land here, there were other coal deposits that people knew about, and they were on the reservation. And they ran along through this area here from Joliet to Fromberg and down to Bridger. And no one had been able to go after that coal because it had been on reservation land. But once the Crow released all this land from their reservation, now those coal deposits were open to be developed. Next slide. And that's when this guy stepped in. This is William Clark. He was one of the guys that was regarded as one of the copper kings of Butte. Owned a huge amount of operations in the Butte area. And he needed coal for his mines and for the smelters in Butte. And so he went out and acquired a bunch of the coal lands just west of the town of Bridger. And having done that, he needed a railroad to get the coal out to Butte. Next slide. So this is what things looked like in 1898. We had the Rocky Fork branch down to Red Lodge, and now Clark had his mine that he wanted to open up here at Bridger. Well, so he went to the Northern Pacific Railroad. He and another guy, a guy named Sam Gibo, who owned a bunch of coal properties up to the north where Fromberg would be. And they worked out a deal with the Northern Pacific where they would jointly pay to build a railroad down to his mine at Bridger. So it was what you would call a joint venture. It was going to be a partnership. Next slide. And so in 1898, they did build a rail line, started at Silesia and ran through Fromberg and down to Clark's mine in Bridger. So that was great. Railroads were getting built. Next slide. Oh yeah, and then This was the Northern Pacific's Clark's Fork branch. Next slide. So Elijah Smith still needed a railroad up to Bear Creek for his coal mining operation. And he knew that William Clark had worked this deal out with the Northern Pacific. So Elijah went and got a hold of this guy. This is Charles Mellon. He was the president of the Northern Pacific Railroad at the time. And Elijah said, I know you did a deal with Clark and Jibo. Let's do a deal kind of like that. I'll pay for half of it. You guys pay for half of it and run the railroad. And we can start developing my mine down there at Bear Creek. Charles Mellon, he was that kind of a tough, stern old guy. He didn't even bother to write back to Elijah. He just ignored him. So next slide. When a year later the railroad to Bridger was finished, and Smith wrote a real nice letter to Charles Mellon again and said, hey, I know you finished that railroad down to Bridger. How about let's push on and get a railroad down to Bear Creek? And again, old Charles Mellon didn't bother writing back to him. So what the heck was going on, with all of this? Well, to understand all of this stuff, we got to go back in history, because Elijah Smith had history with the people of the Northern Pacific, and it wasn't all good. So let's jump back in time. Next slide. This is a map of the Northern Pacific Railroad. It ran from Duluth on Lake Superior all the way to Tacoma. And it was chartered by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. The motivation for building it, the government wasn't going to give the railroad any subsidies or any loans to build it, but they were going to get a huge land grants. For every mile of railroad they built, they got a huge amount of land on either side of the right-of-way. And that was a pretty big incentive for people. So the first guy that jumped in after the Civil War ended was a guy named J. Cooke, who Cooke City is named for. Jay was a financier and a banker, and he got the railroad moving, and he made it as far as Bismarck, North Dakota, in 1873. And again, there was a huge stock market collapse in 1873 called the Panic of 1873. Funding disappeared. Jay Cooke went bankrupt, and the railroad was stalled in 1873, sitting in the middle of nowhere, basically. At Bismarck, there wasn't anything at Bismarck. So it sat there for about 6 years. Nothing happened on the railroad, until a guy named Frederick Billings entered the scene. Frederick Billings came in and reorganized the company, found a bunch of new investors to get the railroad moving again. Interesting thing I just learned about Frederick Billings. Of course, he's got a town here named after him, but he is an attorney, and he made his money in California. He went to California during the California Gold Rush and made a lot of money as an attorney adjudicating land title issues in the gold fields. And he was really well thought of, an important guy in California at the time. And the state legislature thought so much of him that when the California legislature decided that they were going to build the first university in the state of California, they wanted to name it after Frederick Billings. And Frederick Billings said, no, you don't need to do that, but I'll tell you who you do need to name it after. He had an English philosopher from the 1600s that Billings thought a lot of, and he said, do me a favor and name your university after this philosopher. And that guy's name was George Berkeley. And so the first university built in California was UC Berkeley, not UC Billings, just because of what Frederick told him. But anyway, that's an aside. So Frederick Billings got the railroad moving out of Bismarck in 1879, and shortly after he got the railroad going, a guy that I mentioned earlier named Henry Villard stepped in, kind of eased Billings out of the presidency and took the company over. Villard owned a bunch of properties in Washington and Oregon, And he wanted to make sure that when the Northern Pacific was completed, that it served his interests out on the West Coast. And so he wanted to be in charge and make sure that the railroad went where he wanted it. One of his partners, like I said, in these properties out in Washington and Oregon was a guy named Elijah Smith. So they were partners in some of these things, and so Villard and Smith were kind of connected that way. Well, Villard managed to push the railroad through, and it was completed in late 1883. But he didn't actually build it all the way, because Villard already controlled a railroad that they had built in Oregon called the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company. And so to finish the Northern Pacific, he hooked it into the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company at a place called Wallula, Washington, which is near Pasco. And then he used the tracks of this railroad all the way into Portland, and then built Northern Pacific line up to Tacoma from there. So this was all good and well as long as Villard controlled this railroad. But the thing that happened is, in the process of him building the Northern Pacific, he bankrupted himself and the railroad. And so the Northern Pacific was in bad shape by 1884, and they booted Villard out as president. And he lost control of not only the Northern Pacific, but he lost control of the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company. And lo and behold, who took over as the president of Oregon Railway and Navigation but Elijah Smith. And Elijah Smith didn't have any allegiance to the Northern Pacific, and he knew that he had them because they needed him to get to the West Coast. And so he started putting the screws to the Northern Pacific as soon as he was in control. He was doing everything he could to make life miserable for the people at the Northern Pacific. And he hooked up the Oregon Railway and Navigation with the Union Pacific Railroad so that he could run the two railroads against each other. He started overcharging for freight haul along his line, and he ultimately pushed the Northern Pacific into building their own line through the Cascade Mountains into Tacoma so that they wouldn't have to deal with him and the Oregon Railway and Navigation. Once the Northern Pacific built their connection through here, Elijah Smith leased the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company to the Union Pacific Railroad. So now the NP had a direct competitor getting freight to and from Portland. So none of these things made the people in the Northern Pacific very happy with Elijah Smith. It turns out it took several years, but Henry Villard gathered himself up financially and re-entered the scene in 1889 and had a big fight with Elijah and managed to boot him out. And Villard took over again, and that's why in 1889 Elijah Smith was looking for something to do, and that's when he partnered up with Phil Gallaher to get involved in the Montana Railroad and coal scene. So this is all back story, but it's important because 10 years after all of this went down, the NP was still mad, and it was payback time as far as they were concerned. Next slide. Yeah, so when Smith came to the Northern Pacific and said, would you guys help me build a railroad to my coal mine? They said, no, we're not even talking to you. And they went beyond that. They went up into the Bear Creek Valley. They teamed up with Anaconda Copper, and they began buying up all the coal land all around where Elijah Smith's coal properties were. And their plan was, we're just going to squeeze him out. We're not going to build a railroad. His mine won't be of any value without a railroad. He'll sell out to us, and we'll own the whole thing, which is what they did here in Red Lodge. They had monopolized it. They owned all the coal operations here in Red Lodge, and they had plans to just do the same thing over the hill in Bear Creek. So that was their plan. Next slide. But Smith was an ornery guy too. He wouldn't sell out cheap. And instead he went ahead and opened a mine up in 1900 and started hauling his coal out in wagons. And this irritated the people at the Northern Pacific. Charles Mellon was frustrated with him. But they had partners. The Northern Pacific had done all of this with Anaconda Copper as their partner, and Anaconda was tired of waiting. They had spent money to buy coal over at Bear Creek, and by 1902, they were saying, look, we've waited long enough, he's not going to sell, let's build a railroad and get that coal out there, we need it for our operations in Butte. Well, so Charles Mellon finally gave up and said, okay, we'll run a survey, we'll build a railroad from Bridger down to Bear Creek and get the coal. But that's as far as his plan went. Nothing more happened. Well, what's going on now? Next slide. Well, enter a new player. This is Jim Hill. He was known as the Empire Builder. He had built the Great Northern Railroad, which is the line that runs from St. Paul along the High Line through Montana and into Seattle. And the thing about Jim Hill was he built the Great Northern Railroad without any government support, no land grant, no subsidies from the government. He did it all with private money. And he was so good at running railroads that in 1893, when the panic caused a lot of the railroads in the country to go bankrupt, the Great Northern remained solvent. So he was a great manager. And among the railroads that collapsed into insolvency in 1893 was the Northern Pacific. And the guy that brought the Northern Pacific out of bankruptcy was a guy named J.P. Morgan, who you may have heard of. Morgan stepped in, reorganized the company, but by 1895 he realized he didn't know that much about running railroads. And so he went out and asked Jim Hill to help him manage the Northern Pacific. When Morgan hired Charles Mellon, who we've talked about a little bit already, in 1897, Jim Hill was not very impressed with the selection. Next slide. Hill believed that the problems the NP had that had forced them into bankruptcy was that they spent too much money building branch lines that didn't make them any money. And he felt that Charles Mellon was repeating that mistake. He considered Mellon one of Morgan's overrated underachievers. Wasn't one to mince words. Hill was finally given full control of the Northern Pacific in 1901, and he immediately said there'll be no more branch lines built. Well, so what's going on? He comes out with this edict in 1901. In 1902, Charles Mellon says, oh, I'm going to build a railroad down to Bear Creek. Well, this didn't go over well with Jim Hill, and finally in July of 1903, he stepped in and canceled all of Charles Mellon's plans for a railroad in Bear Creek Valley. After that little fight, Charles Mellon resigned as president of the Northern Pacific. So, we got all this crazy stuff going on. Next slide. Elijah Smith came to town in late 1903, and the Billings Gazette talked to him, and they asked him about the railroad to Bear Creek, and he said as far as he could see, the prospects for it were not of the brightest, at least so far as any immediate move in that direction is concerned. So this was late October 1903. Elijah Smith was about ready to give up on getting the railroad built down to Bear Creek. Well, Elijah may be frustrated and ready to give up, but next slide. Phil Gallaher was not. He was still convinced that we could develop the coal at Bear Creek, and he wanted to see a railroad built to Cooke City. And so for the second time, Phil Gallaher went out and started looking for new partners to get this thing done. And the guy he settled on, next slide, was this guy. This is Chris Yagan. Chris and his brother Peter were big-time movers and shakers in Billings around the turn of the century. They were into everything from real estate and insurance and warehousing and just about any business you can name it. They were the guys in Billings that were in control. The one thing they weren't into was coal mining. And so Phil Gallaher got with Chris and his brother Peter and convinced them that there were fortunes to be made in the coal business and they should get into that. And Chris was always looking for a way to make more money, so he said, sure. So they formed a company called the Bear Creek Coal Company and picked up what was probably the last bit of available land over in the Bear Creek Valley that had any coal on it and went into business but they needed a railroad still. So they had plans for one, and they needed a guy that was going to see that railroad get built. So next slide. The guy they ended up bringing in, Phil Gallaher, knew this guy from years back. His name was Frank Hall. He was a young guy from Milwaukee. Didn't have much experience really in the railroad business. He'd come out to Montana in 1898 and had built a short 7-mile long railroad up on Bozeman Pass to a coal mine, but that was about all the railroad experience Frank had. He'd been involved in several other questionable business ventures along the way. But the one thing Frank had was after he got to Montana, he developed this dream that he was going to build a tourist railroad to the Yellowstone. And that was Frank's dream, and he was in his mid-30s, and he was full of energy, and I guess Phil Gallaher felt that if anybody was going to get that railroad built, that Frank Hall was the guy that could do it. So Gallaher brought Frank in and introduced him to some investors that he had found in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Oh, I should back up and say, so what was their plan? Okay, no, that's fine. Go ahead to the next slide. So here was their plan again. Next slide. They were going to build a line from Bridger down to a new town called Belfry. And then they were going to build a little branch from Belfry up into the Yeagan Brothers coal mine in Bear Creek. And they were going to get that little railroad into operation. And they were going to use the cash that they made off of hauling coal. Next slide. And they were going to use that cash to extend the line from Belfry up to Clark's Fork Canyon all the way to Cooke City and Yellowstone National Park. And that was Frank Hall's dream, was to get this line right here completed. So next slide. So in 1904, next slide, this was called the Yellowstone Park Railroad. So, next one. Well, Frank Hall's plans didn't sit well with the people of the Northern Pacific, believe it or not. This is Thomas Oakes. He was president of the company in the late 1800s, but he remained on the board of directors after that. But he stated pretty clearly that it's our policy is to oppose the building of any lines connecting with our main line unless we have control thereof and absolute ownership. So the Northern Pacific was not happy to hear that Frank Hall had plans to build a railroad that was going to connect to them. They felt like if there was a railroad to be built in Montana, it was going to be a Northern Pacific railroad, and they didn't need interlopers sneaking in and building railroads in their territory. Next slide. So, that's when the fight started. Next slide, please. When Charles Mellon resigned, Jim Hill, who's here, went out and handpicked his successor, and the guy that he picked was Howard Elliott. And Howard Elliott, this feller here, the bowler hat with a cigar stub in his fingers, became the president of the NP in 1903. Of course, Hill wasn't happy about Frank Hall's ideas, and so neither was Howard Elliott. Next slide. In January of 1904, when the NP became aware of Frank Hall's plan, the acting chief engineer, E.J. Pearson, told Howard Elliott, the past history of the short connecting road under foreign ownership has not been entirely satisfactory, in view of which it suggested that when traffic south of Bridger is such to justify the construction and operation of a railway line, it should be exclusively a Northern Pacific proposition. So they were laying out their position, and they didn't like what Frank was up to. Well, Frank was either unaware of all this or didn't care what the Northern Pacific thought, because Frank was a man with a dream, and he was going to forge on ahead regardless of what the people of the Northern Pacific thought. So next slide. In April, two investors from Pennsylvania came out to look the thing over. A guy named Orrin Belfry, who was a physician from Philadelphia, and a guy named George Heisey. He's an attorney from Lancaster. And they came out, and Frank and Phil Gallaher showed them around the Clark's Fork Valley, and they agreed to put up the money for a survey and the acquisition of the right-of-way for a railroad at Bear Creek. This got him rolling. So a month later, Frank had lined up a bunch of other small-time investors in Pennsylvania. These were like tobacco farmers and doctors and attorneys. There was no big money behind this railroad, just a lot of small-time investors buying $1,000 or $10,000 worth of construction bonds from them. But Frank was ready to start rolling. So next slide. He was excited. This is January 1906. He's quoted in the Butte Intermountain, and I'll read it. Work will be pushed on this main line as rapidly as possible, and when it's complete, we shall have a scenic route that will present views and vistas grander than those of the world-famous Rio Grande, Grand Canyon, or Royal Gorge, places that Frank had probably never seen. Our road will afford a new gateway to the park, and owing to the attractive features of this 125-mile ride, we expect it will become one of the most popular routes for tourists to that natural wonderland. So, in January of 1906, Frank was excited, and he thought his dream of a railroad to the park was finally going to happen. Next slide. Well, Frank built the railroad. He managed to get it built. This is the Yegan Brothers mine. He managed to get it built into Bear Creek by August of 1906, and in September, the first coal was finally shipped out from the Yegan Brothers mine. You can look at this. This is talk about this later on the field trip, but here's their coal tipple. You can see they brought the coal down off the mountain on this tramway into the tipple. This is the boiler house where they generated electricity to operate the mine equipment. And back in those days, they loaded coal into boxcars. So you can see all the boxcars lined up at the coal mine. Next slide. Well, Frank was in business. He was hauling coal, and Howard Elliott wasn't the least bit happy with this whole thing. So Howard begins to develop a plan to put an end to Frank Hall. Next slide. So, yeah, by 1907, Northern Pacific feels like the Yellowstone Park Railroad is a nuisance, and they want it gone. They want Frank to sell out cheap. So, they decide to arrange to make sure that he never makes a profit. Well, the thing is, Frank had built the railroad on a shoestring. He had these small-time investors. He had scraped up just enough money to get the railroad built. He had barely enough money to buy the first locomotive, but he had no money to buy any railroad cars. So he was totally dependent on the Northern Pacific to supply him with cars to haul the coal in. And the Northern Pacific realized that. And they thought, well, we just won't give him any train cars. And if he doesn't have any cars, he can't haul any coal, and he's going to go out of business. And we'll just buy his railroad up for cheap once he has to file for bankruptcy. So that's a pretty nice way to do business back in those days. So before I move on, this is a shot of Frank Hall's railroad. This is the Clarks Fork River. This picture was taken just a few miles north of Belfry. And you can see the tracks here along the river cut into the side of the hill. Next slide. So in October 1907, Howard Elliott explains to one of his people that people in Livingston have been given instructions to keep down the supply of cars for Mr. Hall's road to the lowest point possible. And he went on to tell him the only reason any cars at all were being given is that for the last few months is to keep quiet as possible the Billings and Montana people who might go to the Montana Railroad Commission and make a disturbance. So he was, you know, his plan was working. He was just parsing out a few cars just to keep everybody quiet. So they were putting the squeeze on poor old Frank. Next slide. Well, by September of 1908, Elliott's plan was working pretty well. The mines seldom were in operation more than half the time because they just didn't have any rail cars to load. And it was crippling the Yellowstone Park Railroad, and poor old Frank's dream of finishing that railroad and building it to Cooke City was going down the drain pretty quick. This is a picture of part of the Yegan Brothers mine. A train just pulled in here. The town of Bear Creek is right down there. And these big things here that are built up are called slack piles. And slack is a waste product. It's the smallest size coal. When the coal comes out of the mine, they run it through a series of screens. And the coal that people want to buy comes in bigger lumps. And the coal that's real small, an inch or an inch and a half across, nobody wants to buy because it burns too fast. Stove grates in people's houses at the time weren't set up for it. The coal would just fall through the grates. And so the slack coal, as it's called, was considered a waste product. And so once they screened the slack out, they just hauled it up and dumped it in these big piles here. So this is slack. Next slide. So that was September. In October of '08, Frank Hall goes public in the newspaper and says, the NP is trying to squeeze me out of business. And of course the NP immediately writes a rebuttal and says, oh, we have a car shortage of our own. We're not putting the screws to Frank. We don't have any cars. We can't give him the cars he needs. Well, everybody in Montana knew that was nonsense, but it didn't matter. The people in Pennsylvania who paid for the railroad were getting frustrated, and they laid the blame on Frank Hall. So next slide. In 1909, the board of directors of the Yellowstone Park Railroad vote Frank Hall out of office and send him down the road. And they reorganized the company as the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern Railroad. Right there. But that doesn't change anything. You know, the Northern Pacific is still determined to run them out of business. They don't care who's the president. Next slide. As a further level of intimidation, in June of 1909, Howard Elliott announces that the Northern Pacific is going to go ahead and build a railroad that parallels the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern. They're just going to duplicate the railroad and run them out of business that way. It was mostly just a jab at intimidation to try to get the people in Pennsylvania to sell out cheap again. But that didn't work. They didn't sell out cheap. Next slide. So what was at stake here? Why were these people fighting over this so much? Well, in 1909, when all of this was happening, there were 5 coal mines up there. You see the town of Bear Creek here. Starting up at Washoe, Anaconda Copper had a mine for their operations. Then just down the road is where Montana Coal and Iron Company had their Smith mine. That was their main operation there. And the Yagan brothers, just down the road, had their mine called the Bear Creek Coal Company. And then up this side valley called Virtue Gulch, actually, not Cooley, there were 2 more mines, the Smokeless and Sootless mine up at the end, and another company called the International Coal Mine. So in 1909, there was a lot of coal mining going on up in the Bear Creek Valley. And 10 years later, 2 more mines were opened up, the Foster and the Eagle Mine. Foster Gulch. So there was a lot of potential traffic for a railroad to fight over. So that's what the whole thing was really about. Next slide. In January 1910, the mine owners were complaining. They weren't getting enough cars. The mines weren't being able to operate at full time. And so the Railroad Commission held a big meeting, a hearing. They reprimanded Montana, Wyoming, and Southern for failing to perform its duties, but they also took the Northern Pacific to task for not supplying enough rail cars. The NP, for its part, turned around and tried to blame the other railroads in the area. They said if the coal that was being shipped was going to a customer on the Great Northern, or the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or the Milwaukee Road, which were the other railroads in the state, then they should supply the cars, not the Northern Pacific. Well, that was kind of a specious argument, really, at best, but they tried to shift the blame off of themselves. Next slide. But people knew what the NP was up to. The Bridger Times wrote an editorial after the hearing and said, the Northern Pacific engineered the deal from start to finish, brought on this remarkable commission inquiry. It appears to the average person that the Northern Pacific wants Bear Creek territory for its own, which is exactly what was going on. Maneuvered things in such a way as to force the Railroad Commission to hold a hearing and place the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern in a position of defendant on trial for its life. So, you know, the NP wasn't fooling anybody with their scheme. This is a shot of the railroad yard in Belfry. They had a pretty significant sized engine house. Here were the machine shops. You can see water tank, And this is their coal tower for loading coal in their locomotives. And you can see the trackage in that area. Next slide. So in October, after all of this, the people in Pennsylvania finally had enough, and they tried to sell the railroad to the MP for $1 million. It had cost them $500,000 to build, so the people in Pennsylvania were being a little bit greedy. They just wanted to double their money when they sold the railroad. Howard Elliott wasn't buying. The price was way too high. Elliott breaks off from negotiations in 1910 and says, you know, we still might build our own railroad, but we're not buying yours. But for the next 3 years, nothing happens, and Howard Elliott finally moves on down the road in August of 1913. Next slide. He's replaced by this guy, Jewel Hannaford. Hannaford comes in, and he drops plans for building a railroad paralleling the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern, but he doesn't do much else. They still are shorting the mines on the cars they need, and Hannaford makes no effort to really solve the problem. The railroad still is limping along with whatever cars they can get supplied. Next slide. Well, so finally, 1917, the United States gets involved in the First World War. In April of 1918, the federal government takes control of all the country's railroads. And the USRA, the United States Railroad Administration, tells the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern that they have to supply cars to the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern in any quantity their business requires. So that was the first change. The government forced them to quit this nonsense of shorting of cars. And at about the same time, this guy, William Bunny, came in and took over as general manager. Now, Bunny was an ex-Northern Pacific guy, and so he knew all the people at NP. And he started to smooth things out with his ex-company. And things started to move along better in 1918 for both railroads. Next slide. 1918 was the year that the mines in Bear Creek hit their maximum production. They hauled out 692,000 tons of coal that year, and that was the peak that would be reached for the area. This again is another shot of the Yeagan Brothers Bear Creek mine down here. Next slide. Well, things continued to get a little bit better. In 1921, the Northern Pacific and the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern agreed to what's called joint agency. They had one guy in Bridger who was going to sort out all the cars and make sure that everything ran smoothly. So it was just a matter of smoothing out sort of the administrative side of the two railroads working together. And then in December of 1926, the two railroads agreed to joint passenger service, and they put into service this machine, which is a gasoline electric doodle bug sort of rail car, and you could ride this from Bear Creek to Billings in 3 hours, which was a huge improvement. And they ran it up and back every day except Sunday. People in Bear Creek were now able to ride into Billings and do some shopping and get back for supper. So this was a huge improvement for them back in 1926. So cooperation again. It was running Northern Pacific machine all the way up to Bear Creek. Next slide.
But still no connection to Red Lodge from Bear Creek.
No connection from Red Lodge to Bear Creek. You had to go up to Silesia and then down to get to Red Lodge. Well, the thing that happened after 26, of course, 29 was the stock market crash. And that was about the same time that the Northern Pacific, which had been operating the mines here in Red Lodge, started shutting things down. They closed the West Side mine here in Red Lodge in 1924, and in 1932 they were closing down the East Side mine, so they were shifting the coal. Of course, they used the coal for their locomotives, and they were shifting their operations from the Red Lodge area to a new mine that they had opened at Coal Strip. And they were going to start mining Coal Strip coal because it was cheaper to mine, and so things were starting to slow down here. And as Northern Pacific moved their coal operations out to Coal Strip, they were still a little bit worried about relying on one mine for all of their coal fuel, and they wanted to keep the mines in Bear Creek in operation. And they had to keep the railroad going do that as well. So in 1933, as things were slipping into the Great Depression, they formed an agreement with the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern that allowed Northern Pacific to run their trains all the way south from Bridger all the way into Belfry. So that relieved the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern of a lot of back and forth moves with their locomotives. So all they had to do was haul the coal from the mines down to Belfry, and now Northern Pacific would come pick it up for them. So that was a big improvement. And then on top of that, they also at the same time signed an agreement that said we will buy a minimum of 100,000 tons of coal a year from the Bear Creek mines. So these two things were aimed at getting the railroad and the mines in Bear Creek through the Great Depression. And it worked, and they did. So next slide. Of course, World War II came along. Things picked up quite a bit. Mining operations, a lot more coal was needed. Peak production during the Second World War came in 1944. They shipped 576,000 tons of coal out that year. 150,000 tons went to the Northern Pacific. 150,000 tons went to the Army and the Navy. This was also a time, because of the war, that things were ramping up pretty fast. And in 1943, in February, the Smith mine, which is shown here, is where the huge underground explosion occurred that killed 74 miners. So that was part of the big ramp up during the war. But obviously that caused the Smith mine here to shut down. They closed this mine off. But they shifted their operations to their Foster mine, and were still able, a year later in 44, to hit the maximum output for the Second World War. But as I say here, the reprieve of the war was a short-lived phenomenon. When the war ended, people need for coal started to drop off pretty quickly. People were moving to natural gas for their heat and their cooking. Factories, which they had been shipping coal to the sugar beet plant in Billings, was a big customer for coal. They converted to natural gas. There's a big cement plant near Three Forks that used a lot of coal to make cement. They converted to natural gas at about this time. Of course, the railroads were converting to diesel engines, so the need for coal on the railroads was going down. So the market for coal was falling away pretty quickly by the end of the Second World War. Next slide. So yeah, 1951, they were loading less than 10 cars of coal a day on Bear Creek. And the end came in 1953, June. The Northern Pacific canceled their contract to buy coal, and the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern Railroad shut down a month later. The tracks laid there in place, waiting for somebody to come in and take them over. Nobody volunteered to pick up the railroad, and so in October of '55, the scrapping crews came in and pulled the tracks up. This is a shot of the railroad about that time, just south of Bridger, heading down to Parks Fork Valley. You can see the quality of highways that you had to deal with back in those days. So that's basically my story. Next slide. And go ahead with the next one. So now for a moment of shameless self-promotion, as Becky mentioned. Next slide. I do have a book called Black Diamonds from the Treasure State. If you're interested, there's a lot more information about all of this that I've been talking about. And we have it in the museum gift shop here if you're interested. So, I think I'm pretty much on time. Yeah, 34. I guess I got maybe time for some questions if you want. Otherwise, let me just say that those of you who want to go on the field trip, we're going to head over the hill into Bear Creek. The first stop we'll make, you go through downtown Bear Creek and you turn right on 4th Street South, which is, I think, pretty much the last street you can turn on as you go through Bear Creek right before you leave town. But look for 4th Street South and hang a right there if you get there ahead of me. Otherwise, look for my gray Toyota. So, anyway, any questions?
I do have a question. Are you familiar with the Powder River Basin coal up there?
Generally.
The petrified wood that we find, I work at an open pit mine up there in Gillette.
Okay.
Eagle Butte mine. You see petrified trees, they're standing straight up in the high wall, So my question is, something had to have happened awful quick to keep those trees upright. You know, they didn't fall down because they rotted. They were upright when the whatever happened. What happened to bury a tree
Yeah.
upright?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, all I can do is speculate that there must be so much other vegetation around it and dying and falling in that, you know, I mean, that tree could have died a long time earlier and just stayed upright as other plants grew around it and kind of supported it. And
This is in the overburden, not in the coal.
oh, not in the coal.
You
Oh.
never see petrified wood in coal.
Oh, okay.
But you see it in the overburden.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, in that case, I mean, if you're in a situation where if the tree was there and I would have to, again, just speculate that you had rivers and stuff moving through that area and all of a sudden you had a big dump of sediment, sand or something there that shored up the base of the tree so it didn't fall over and eventually buried it, you know.
Some of this petrified wood is, I mean, it's big.
Yeah.
You find some, I found some that big around to, you know, they have some in the front of the mine, huge. I mean, this
Really?
stuff is big.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big.
It's hard to imagine what this country
Yeah.
looked like 60 million years ago. I mean, it was an incredible forest, swamp, lakes, rivers. It was kind of amazing.
Because in our mine, we have two layers of coal, two seams. We call it the Smith is the lower, it's a better, higher BTU because it's deeper. And you have a parting, you know, so much, they call it dirt in between. You can see it. And you got your rolling Smith up here, or your rolling seam. But yeah, it's just amazing what took place back then. And then the overburden, on top of the coal, it's gray. The dirt is gray, it's not black like you think. It's gray, and then on top of that, it's more sandy color, like a brown. Looks like brown sugar almost.
Yeah,
It's a brown color.
yeah.
It's pretty interesting to
It's
see.
hard to visualize how all that happened. Yeah. In the back. Yes, ma'am.
As a coal geologist who studied the early development of coal deposits in Red Lodge, I have to give my 2 cents for that. Okay, the word discovery has a whole different meaning when you talk about coal versus gold. And there's a diary of Walter Cooper, who was a gunsmith and bowsman, who led hunting parties over here on Crow Land, who says you could see the coal for miles, perhaps not miles, but it's black, and it contrasts with the rock surrounding it. So as long as you could get close enough to see that it burned, because you could confuse it with black shale, as you know, as a geologist. So in his diary, in 82, when the land was opened for claiming, he came over here, this is all in his diary, to make a claim, and discovered that James George and 3 of his partners had already created a post of discovery claiming 640 acres. Now, so James George, who hung around Bozeman, had already lined up all his partners before he staked the claim. And those 4 people, one was Alexander Smith Hunley, who had a Crow wife who lived nearby because they could live on the reservation because he had a Crow wife. Enoch Douglas Ferguson, who was a businessman in Bozeman, and Rosa Black, interesting, a woman who was the wife of Madison Black, who was the county clerk of Gallatin County. Why James George somehow is associated with it. It may be that he was the one here to try to develop the mine. You can actually see the spoil of the #1 seam, which is considered the Yankee Jim claim. It's been covered over now, but you can see a pile of spoil up there on the hillside. However, the other seams were covered with float, so you couldn't, in other words, debris that came down from above. So unless you went digging, you might not know there were 9 seams there. But at the same time, Henry Villard created something called the Northern Transcontinental Survey. He was he wanted to know where the branch lines would be for the main line. And he sent 2 geologists out here. One was John Elliott Wolf. And their activities out here are published in government documents from the 1880 census, which didn't get actually published till 1886. But in there they say, we saw James George's, quote, discovery or claim. And we ourselves uncovered several other seams. And then they actually traced those seams all the way to the Clarks Fork River, through Bear Creek, what became Bear Creek. And they estimated the tonnage. So that information went directly to the Northern Pacific Railroad. And what the Northern Pacific Railroad did then at that point, they sent a mining engineer out here named James Alexander. And his report to the railroad management was, we should be interested in acquiring property around Red Lodge and not Bear Creek, because in Red Lodge there's a cliff. And so you could bring the coal from the seam out, and by gravity, bring it out on a trestle, and by gravity the coal could be loaded then into cars. Whereas in Bear Creek, there are gentle slopes up to the seams, and so you don't have the advantage of gravity of trying to create a mine plan and a sale plan. So that's why the coal deposits in Bear Creek never got developed until 1906. Much more difficult to mine, and not nearly as many tons mined in Bear Creek as were mined here in Red Lodge. So anyway, I don't want to make this a lecture, but just wanted to point that out.
Is there another question?
There's a couple other names up in the Beartooth, Hauser and Loosecamp. Are they connected with this story at all?
Yeah. Hauser, of course, he was a territorial governor here, and he had his fingers in all sorts of.
Actually, Hauser was the one that consolidated all the claims. When Walter Cooper discovered that James George and his friends had claimed 640 acres, the next best thing was to claim the acreage around that. So he proceeded to do that. He got his father-in-law, he got everybody he knew to claim 160 acres, because an individual could only, as I said.
And we named all our streets after them.
An individual could only claim 160 acres, so you had to have a whole group. And then so the Northern Pacific Railroad hired Hauser, paid Hauser to consolidate all those claims, so they were under the ownership of the Northern Pacific Railroad. And the reason the Northern Pacific didn't develop the mine right away and supported the Rocky Fork Coal Company, it was a typical Gilded Age business practice where the officers of a corporation would get control of something, and then they would sell it to the corporation of which they were a member of the board for an increased amount of money, and they would make, as investors, they would make a lot of money. And there was a court case about the practice of the Northern Pacific doing this in a number of cases, and one included the coal deposits here, but the judge said no, and that one was not illegal. So anyway, they decided to let the Rocky Fork Coal Company go ahead and mine the coal, and when the opportunity was right, they purchased the mine and started to operate it professionally, because the Rocky Fork Coal Company personnel were kind of amateurs. Their surveyors weren't very good. If you look at the early mine maps, the entries look like they're going to converge on each other. They weren't parallel. They mined too close to the surface up on the east bench, and there were a lot of sinkholes that have been filled in since. So the really professional management of the mine.
Hauser had been involved in other railroad stuff with the NP. That first branch line they built down to Cinnabar from Livingston, the NP wasn't allowed to build, their charter didn't allow them to build branch lines. They were allowed to buy existing railroads, but they couldn't build one themselves in the original charter. And so they got, their initial thing with Hauser was to get Hauser to build the railroad down to Cinnabar for them, and then they bought that railroad from him. And basically, he did the same thing with the Rocky Fork in Cooke City. With their backing, he built the railroad from Laurel down here to Red Lodge, and then effectively sold it to the NP. And Hauser made money, and all his people made money every time, like she mentioned on that. So he was involved in all sorts of stuff like that. The other guy you mentioned, what was the
Loose
name?
Camp. L-O-S-E-K-A-M-P.
Yeah, that's not a name I'm familiar with.
And he
so.
might not have been railroad.
Yeah. Anyone else? Anything? Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the slack piles? Did they just get overgrown or they were removed?
No, all that area's been reclaimed, and I think mostly they were smoothed over. You know, they've kind of been. If you go on the field trip, you'd have to see, but you go over there now, and there's no sign. Both the Smith mine and all of the mines had huge slack piles associated with them. And as best as I can determine, they just recontoured it, smoothed everything out, and that slack is still there, but you don't know it at this point.
So how did they mine back in those days? I mean, they didn't have longwall miners. I mean, how did they do that?
The main mining method here was what's called room and pillar, where they would go in, they would excavate a main haulage way, a gangway, into the coal seam. The coal seams were nearly horizontal here, so you didn't have to go down initially. They would start at an outcrop, build the haulage way into it, and then build either they would be perpendicular, or in a lot of cases more like a herringbone pattern, where they would do drifts off in a pattern like that, like herringbone, and then they would cross cut again with another set of drifts that perpendicular to the ones that they had just done, leaving pillars of coal to support the mine roof the whole way.
But how do they chew it up and get it out? I mean, the picks and axe.
They blasted it.
Oh, they did blast
Yeah,
it.
they were
I was
blasting
wondering how
it.
they-
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
that makes sense.
So,
Wow.
there was the mine, William Smith's mine at Bridger. They did do longwall, so they went in with machinery, did longwall mining, but then you had to do a lot of cribbing to hold up the mine roof there. So most of the mines here were room and pillar. Anyone?
So what's all part of the field trip?
Okay, we're gonna go over to Bear Creek. The first stop, we're gonna talk about where the old railroad station was. I'll show you the right-of-way where the railroad came through Bear Creek. There's the remains of an old railroad trestle to look at. And then we'll walk up the hill a little ways and look up Foster Gulch, where there was a branch line that ran up to one of Montana coal and irons. And you can see the remains of where the roadbed is for the railroad. And so forth, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Then we'll loop up onto the Brophy Road and take a little hike down the valley. There's the remains of the water tank that they used for the locomotives. The cement foundation is still there, so I think it's kind of cool. And that was an area called International Junction, where all of the tracks from the various mines came together, and where they sorted the cars and so forth. And so they had a water tank there, so you can just kind of turntable for turning the locomotives. That's all gone, but you can kind of see the excavation where the turntable was. We'll look at that, and then zip back onto the highway, pull off where the Yegan Brothers mine was, kind of talk about, imagine what it looked like when it was there, and then go up the road a little bit to where the Smith mine is, and we can visit about that just a little bit. Those are my main.
So where is this at? Where do we go from here?
Go through town and look for the turnoff that says Belfry, and make a left, go over the hill, and drop down on the other side, and you're going to end up in the town of Bear Creek. And like I say, drive through downtown Bear Creek, and just about at the end of town, look for 4th Street South, which will be a right-hand turn, and just wing off there, and I'll rendezvous with you, and we'll just take it from there.
Has anyone not signed the release form yet?
Oh yeah, anybody who's going on the trip, we are going to be trespassing on the Sunlight Ranch at the Brophy Road stop, so if anybody wants to go on the field trip, you need to sign a release that says that you won't sue them if you break your leg. So please do that. Yes, sir.
In 55, what lines were picked up exactly? Was it just from Belfry to Bear Creek that the lines were
Yeah.
pulled up, or what? Okay, so when was the Red Lodge line pulled up?
I think that was around 1970. It was
Okay.
right about the time of the Burlington Northern merger. Yeah, and I think that's the same for the line, the NP line down to Bridger. I think it came up around that time in the early 70s.
So this building in Red Lodge over across the street, about a block off, that's the old train depot? Looks
Yeah.
like a train depot? Okay.
And I should mention, you know, we're not going to go there, but the train depot for the Yellowstone Park Railroad, the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern, is still in Belfry, right along the highway as you go. If you go through Bear Creek and down to Belfry, where the T is there, if you look just over there to your left, across the street, you'll see the old train station that Frank Hall built in 1906 for the Yellowstone Park Railroad. People are living in it now. I'm getting the signal. We need to go.
I was, yes. We sold them, two properties. Decided they were in eastern.
Well, this is beautiful downtown Bear Creek. The thing I want to tell you about, you can look right here, see how this kind of sticks out into the creek there. You're looking at the roadbed for the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern, and the tracks came right through here. And so not surprisingly, right up the street called Railroad Alley. So this is where the trains came right into town here. And the interesting thing about this is that this is Dave Snyder's house. It happens to be sitting right on the spot where the railroad depot was.
Oh.
So this is a picture of the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern depot that was here in Bear Creek. And it sat right there where Dave's house, more or less.
Do you know when they took that out?
I don't. But this picture was taken after abandonment, so probably in 55 or 54 or something, and it looks like it's in pretty rough shape at that time. So I don't know that it would have, been useful for much of anything after that.
So how shiny was this town at one time or another? Did it have an opera house and things like that? Or?
I think the opera house was restricted to Red Lodge, but I'm trying to remember what the max population was, and that escapes me. There was several thousand, though.
In this valley.
Yeah.
Were there any fancy houses and a wrong side of the
32
railroad
bars
track?
and no churches.
I don't think, I think all the real wealth was on the other side of the hill, I think, This was more of a rough and tumble kind of mining town.
So this was the other side of the tracks.
Mostly immigrants who came here from all over Eastern Europe. If you go up to the cemetery up here on the hill, there's some great descriptions.
Yeah.
So the cemetery on that side of town.
Yeah.
When you go down there, there's that sign that points you up the hill to it.
You can see it from here, right behind that power pole and the transformer on that power pole.
The other thing that used to be right here, and I didn't show you a picture during my talk, and I don't have one to share with you, but in 1917, the railroad bought a peculiar-looking gasoline-powered rail car called a McKean. It was built in like 1905 or something. It was a strange-looking thing. They called it the submarine because it had a pointy front like a ship, and the windows on the side were portholes.
be a cocoon, maybe.
And the Montana, Wyoming, and Southern bought it secondhand in 1917, and that was the main passenger service. The interesting thing about that McKean is that it had a gas engine, but it was connected with a chain drive to the front axle. So it was kind of a, wait till this guy just, and the thing didn't have a reverse gear. And so the way they reversed the McKean was they had to take the top of the engine off and move the camshaft to make the engine run backwards. So this was quite a deal. And the story in my book is about a guy that came here on a sales trip, and when it came time to leave town, he found out that the guy running the McKean ran it back, just didn't ever turn it around. It ran back down the hill, reverse first. Anyway, it was a crazy thing. But anyway, they built what they called a garage to park their McKean rail car in, and it would have been right there beyond that Honda sitting there. So the slope of the land has changed. It's been recontoured, but there would have been a building right across the tracks from the station.
I've heard some residents call it the Galloping Goose.
Right. They either called it the submarine or the Galloping Goose.
And apparently, at one point, it was abandoned in the hills there, west of Belfry.
When they retired it in 1932, and they scrapped the engine and the running gear, and they took the car body and parked it next to the engine house and used it as a tool shed. So as recent as 2005 or something, there were still part of that thing was sitting over in the weeds in Belfry, but it's gone now.
So
I think.
what they told me was true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So having looked at that, this was sort of the heartblood of the railroad, but just for fun to see the remains. This trestle is a trestle across Bear Creek right over here, and if you want to dare walk with me, you can see that the pilings for this trestle are still in place over here. And also a railroad tie, if you look close, you're walking right down the middle of the railroad. So that was just kind of interesting remains of...
It was timber.
Yeah.
And they walk it around.
Yeah.
So those big posts down there are the pilings from the old trestle.
Yeah.
How did you find them? How in the world did you find them?
Wandering around, tracing the roadbed through town. Most of these actually came out of the collection in Red Lodge. A guy named Kidwell was funny. He lived down in Clark, and I came across his name. I tracked him down through the Wyoming Historical Society and finally got a phone number and called him up, and I said, I think you've got a bunch of photographs of that railroad in Bear Creek, you know? And he said, oh yeah, I did. I dropped them off at the museum yesterday. And I was like, are you kidding me? So anyway, I thought that was great, but yeah, that was pretty funny. So a little walk if you're game. We're just going to walk up to the end of the line. Was owned and operated by Montana Coal and Iron. That was Elijah Smith's old company. And then 2 years after that, a group of guys from Red Lodge got what we would call a farm out from Montana Coal and Iron to mine on their property up there. And they set up a company called Eagle Coal Company, and they opened up a mine just past the Foster Gulch mine. So there were 2 mines up at the end of this thing, and the way they accessed it, and I didn't talk about this earlier, but it's a thing called a Y. So this is the main line coming through here, and they had a track that peeled off from the main line and swung through the trees on the other side of the creek and went up the valley, up Foster Gulch. But then, in order to turn the trains around, they came down the hill, and there was another track that swung off along that hillside there, and and connected into the main line further up. So if you can picture the main line here, and then two tracks that swung up like that formed the shape of a Y. And by having that, you can turn the locomotives around. You run them up this way, you run back down that way, and so they can turn trains and locomotives. So a Y is a real common occurrence on railroads back then when you're switching. And we can go up there and you can see where the roadbed was for the Y, and we can look up the valley and try to imagine what the mines look like. If you're game with barbed wire fence where, you know, the sagebrush is kind of cleared out, that was the spur line up Foster Gulch to the Foster Mine and the Eagle Mine. The other arm of the Y is this cut low on, not the one high on the hill, but the one just right across the valley here. You can see the cut in, it's a road now, but that was the other side of the Y. Mm-hmm. And it swung around the hill and hooked back into the main line over there. The interesting story, excuse me, when Frank Hall built the railroad in 1906, he rolled right up here, had this graded, came in and laid cross ties down and was ready to lay the tracks. And Elijah Smith showed up and said, "You don't have a right-of-way on my property. You're on my property here, and I never granted you a right-of-way. And I don't want you building a railroad up here." Elijah was kind of mad at Frank at that point. Frank had made a lot of promises and hadn't really fulfilled a lot of them. And so Elijah was getting to be he ended up in a sanatorium, lost his mind in his later years, but he was getting kind of funny by 1906 and 1907. Anyway, he told Frank, "You don't have permission to build a line up Foster Gulch." And Frank had to come back and pick up all the cross ties and haul them back down. Elijah told him that he'd rather leave the coal in the ground for his grandchildren than have Frank build that line. Well, that was interesting because Elijah was a bachelor, you know, so how long that coal was going to stay in the ground waiting for his grandchildren, I don't know, but that was just kind of a funny story of the interaction between those two guys. But basically, this is the mine. This is what it looked like in the 20s. This is the tipple for Montana Coal and Irons.
And that was further on up the...
Yeah, probably about as far as you can see up the canyon is about where the mines were.
What is a tipple?
Yes, happy you asked. Okay. So, the coal gets mined, it comes out, it goes into the tipple. They call it a tipple because they got these little ore carts on tracks and they tip them over to get the coal out of them.
Okay.
So the place where they dump the coal out is called a tipple.
Good, thank you.
So, but from the tipple they go into a washroom and a screening room. They clean the coal and then they sort it by size, and then from there it gets loaded into the rail cars. Okay. So all of those things usually happen in the tipple, but it's called a tipple for that reason. Because things get tipped over.
Very practical.
Yeah. So anyway, here is Montana Coal and Irons tipple in operation. Now funny, this other thing you see here is the Eagle Coal Company's loading ramp. So I'm not sure, it doesn't appear that they've got a tipple associated with it here, so I'm not sure exactly whether they did the sorting up the canyon where their mine was or what exactly, or whether this is a picture that was taken while it was in construction or whatever. But in any case, this was first put into production in 1917. After Elijah Smith was dead and gone, they built the railroad up this valley. Okay, so in 1917 this got built, and the Foster Gulch mine went into production.
You run across any information about what kind of wood they were using and where they got it? Were they using evergreen lodge poles or something?
I haven't the slightest. Yeah, I do not know that.
Because they obviously not going to harvest a lot of it, right?
Yeah. So the only other thing here that may be of interest is after World War II, they started strip mining here as well, and because several of the coal beds cropped out on that hillside there, and it was getting expensive to do underground mining, and so they decided they'd try strip mining, and they would just dig a bench into the coal bed along the side of the hill. Of course, they couldn't do a lot of mining that way because you can see by the hillside, as you follow a flat coal bed into the side of the hill, the further back you go, the more overburden you got to keep stripping off, and pretty soon it becomes uneconomic to do that. But there were some deep cuts along the hillside here where they strip mined during the late 1940s. All of that's been smoothed over and reclaimed at this point. But,
yeah, the coal seams here were a lot flatter than they were in Red Lodge. At the outcrop there, they dipped about 21 degrees. So when they mined up dip, so that after the coal was loaded, it was a trip.
Follow it down, yeah.
Gravity
the dips
again,
here are
they're flat,
virtually
yeah.
all less than 10 degrees.
They're flat, yeah.
Is there any indication that some of the locals will come and get a little coal to burn? And
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there were a lot of little.
I mean, even today, or
even today, I don't know about even today, but
It mostly comes out of Bridger now.
okay, so there are people using.
When I moved here in the 90s, there was somebody, Boscovich,
Oh, yeah,
Jankovic, yeah, up right as you're coming into town here,
Yeah.
there was a little tiny mine in the hillside there, and he was, that family was still supplying some coal to some people.
Into like 1969 or 70.
Well, this would have been about 89, 90. There was a little bit coming out of there. And
That's
it
my
was-
grandfather.
Oh, okay.
They lived up here on First Street till the early 90s, but
Well,
the
maybe that's what
mine
I-
got shut down.
But they weren't even getting scratching out a little bit for their own use. or
Well,
anything.
for their own use, they would go into some of the slack dumps and screen it to
well,
get
maybe that's where the coal.
stoker coal.
Yeah, because that may be where the coal in Red Lodge was coming from, and when I moved to town there.
Could be.
Well, eventually they had regulations and mine inspectors, and most of those small mines did not meet the
Yeah.
regulations, so they got shut down.
One of the first mines shut down
Yeah,
by
yeah.
MSHA when
Right,
that
exactly.
regulation got
In '84, it was the first abandoned mine lands reclamation project under the Surface Mining Reclamation Control Act. And it was in this area, so any exposed seams, a lot of them got covered up.
Yes,
And so,
including the slack dumps and
right, yeah.
the strip mines.
The rule is 4 feet of topsoil on top of
really?
slack piles. And,
so any questions on all this little bit here? Okay.
Great.
So what I'd like to do now, for those who are up for it, we'll go back, get on the highway, drive through beautiful downtown Bear Creek, look for a road off to the right after you leave town called the Brophy Road. I'll kind of wait there to make sure everybody makes the turn. And we're just going to go a little ways up there and park, and then we're going to take a little walk down the valley, and we're going to look at the rail yard, where the railroad yard was at International Junction, and where their turntable and their water tank was, and stuff like that. So
What were the abandoned buildings on the way over here?
the ones off to the left, that was the Smith Mine. That's the Montana Coal and Iron Smith Mine, named after Elijah Smith. Yeah, we'll have a stop at the end of the trip and talk about that a little bit. So, okay, if you guys are game. Right over there is a place called International Junction, and we'll walk down to it in a minute. That's where, and I don't know if you looked off to your left as we were driving through Bear Creek, but you can see the roadbed pretty clearly as you come through town. If you look down into the valley, I don't know if you did, but anyway, the roadbed is pretty apparent as you come up here. So the main line came up, and that was their switching yard over there, and we'll go look at that in a minute. But while we're here, so this is where all the branches came in, and this cut right behind you, where you can see where the fence is. You can see a cut in the hill here, and then you can kind of see the little demarcation where all those cows are clustered. That was a branch line called the McCarthy Branch, and this valley is called Virtue Gulch. At the very top of Virtue Gulch is a mine that was originally called the Smokeless and Sootless Mine, and later it was called the Brophy Mine when it closed down. But so it was situated at the very top of the gulch. But then right about where we're standing, there would have been another track that branched off, kind of ran through probably nearly where we're standing, and swung back where the road is that we came in on, and then back into that little side canyon, that first side canyon you see there. And this is a picture of what was called the International Mine. And it was tucked in just into that canyon. So there was the main branch, the McCarthy branch, ran up to the Smokeless and Sootless, and then another branch swung around here, crossed over the little creek here, and ran up the canyon to the International Mine. So there were two mines up Virtue Gulch. These tracks came together here, and then we'll take a little walk here and go down, and let me show you this other picture before we move on. This is the best picture I have. This is the Smokeless and Sootless mine. These were smaller mining operations, but the Smokeless and Sootless that became the Brophy mine was the last one to stay in business. It was in operation, into the 60s, I guess. After the railroad was gone, they were still shipping coal out of the Brophy mine. So it was the last one to die here in the Bear Creek Valley.
Last one selling commercial.
Right.
Side.
Commercial,
coal.
yeah.
My grandfather's mine, the roadside was right across up this little valley, but all they did was sell pickup loads to farms and ranchers.
And the Eagle Mine, for those of you who know about Siegfried, Dr. Siegfried, who was mayor of Red Lodge, the famous tooth came out of the Eagle Mine. That was the one he claimed showed that Bear Creek was a garden of human creation, whatever. It turned out it was a tooth of an extinct mammal, but he kept promoting it as a human tooth.
Oh, is that it?
Even when he knew better.
Even when he knew
Yeah, even when he knew better. So,
Yeah.
so that famous tooth came out of the Eagle Mine.
So yeah, just for a little bit of history, the Smokeless and Sootless was originally developed by J.C. McCarthy, which is why they called it the McCarthy branch, and a guy named Jim Brophy. They were from West Virginia. They were West Virginia miners. James F. Brophy, the dad, sold the mine to his son, James R. Brophy, in 1940. And he changed the name variously from the Brophy Coal Mine to the Clean Coal Company. But anyway, yeah, okay, last operated in 1967. The International Mine was a couple of guys from Red Lodge by the name of Mushbach and another guy named Rosetta. They went bankrupt in 1921, and they sold the company to the Carbon County Coal Company in 1923, and it shut down sometime in the 1930s. So that was the story here. But anyway, so two tracks coming through here, around the corner, down the hill, and if you want to brave the big black cows and follow me, you'll see people, because you couldn't wait around for the mine to go back into, that kind of thing. I think there might have been, some of that here more so than at other areas.
But not as transient as the gold placer mine.
Yeah. So this is International Junction, you see, and this was where the McCarthy and the International branch came down from there. The main line of the railroad, and you can't see it anymore because they've changed the course of Bear Creek, but it came up right through, just to the right of that baler or whatever that is there. Would have crossed Bear Creek there and come right. I'm standing on the foundation of the water tank now. You can all see, this is the water tank, of course, water for the steam locomotives. Okay, and so the main line track would have been on the creek side of where this water tank was. So things have changed a lot since this picture was taken. The other thing you can see in this picture is they had a turntable for turning the locomotives around, and that's what you can see right here. It was actually usually turntables are sunk down into the ground. This turntable was actually built above the ground, and this little depression in the hillside right behind you is where that turntable was located at the time. So water tank here, turntable over there, and then yard tracks for sorting the cars out, extending up the flat area of the valley off in that direction. So the loaded or unloaded cars would be brought to this point and then either hauled up the McCarthy branch or on up the valley to the Yagan Brothers or the Montana Coal and Iron, or all the way up to Washoe to the Anaconda mine. So this was sort of the hub for the railroad.
This pylon or plinth here is part of for the water tower?
Yeah, these are the foundations for the. You can see the big post that the water tank sits on, and each one of them was anchored by one of these concrete blocks. So if you didn't think there was a railroad here once, this is the most concrete evidence. Okay. So anyway, I thought this was really cool when I discovered it, but that's just me. I like this kind of stuff.
I vote cool.
So, anyway, that was. As we walk back, as you dodge the cow pies, if you're lucky, you'll see a lot of coal cinders and coal dust in the dirt scattered through here. It was coming from the locomotives or falling out of the cars that were being shifted around here for 50 years or so.
Before we go, is there a big mystery that you're still looking into? Or you kind of tracked most of them?
I think I've answered most of my questions. Yeah. Although there are some gaps, that I could never figure out, and most of them pertain to the financing of the railroad and stuff like that. There were some things there where some of the lawsuits and things like that came up, and I'm not clear how all that got straightened out. But the basics of how the railroad ran seem pretty clear to me, I'd say.
And most of the major players, once they were fired or dismissed by the board, did they head back east or did they hang out?
Well, the main guy the guy that built it was Frank Hall, like I said. And poor old Frank, I don't know whether he got polio or what, but he was in bad shape by 1909. And when he got run off, he got a settlement. He long story, but he got some money when they ran him off. And the first thing he did was he and his wife went to Baden-Baden, Germany to take the cure at the spas there. And I don't think that did him much good, but he came back and eventually settled in Los Angeles and bought an orange grove. They say it was the best in the valley. He sold it after a few years, made a bunch of money, moved to a place near Long Beach called Signal Hill. And within a few years, other than the fact that his wife died suddenly, other than that, a year or so after that, they discovered oil on Signal Hill.
Wow.
Signal Hill is one of the biggest oil
life.
fields in California. And Frank Hall just happened to own a piece of property that his house was on right in the middle of Signal Hill. So in the end, Frank made some money off of oil too. So but he passed away in 1929, and that was kind of the end of his story. Yeah. Anywho, let's move on before it gets too darn late. Mine was located. You can see the cut of the railroad down right low in the valley here, where the tracks came through and wound on it. So this is probably not quite from where we're standing, but let's see. Yeah, you can see this kind of valley back here is that right over in there. So the main mine workings, the tipple and the boiler house and workshops were all down on the flat here.
So where was the slope? It was the slope, I presume.
The what?
Where was this opening to the slope? The mine.
The mine. Well, so they had this trestle that ran up the hill. I think they were going into bed number 3, and that's all been reclaimed. They had a bench cut into the hillside where bed 3 was, I think, and the main entry would have been kind of right straight across.
There of a flat.
Yeah, kind of straight across would have been the main entry into the mine.
And I wonder what that was.
Oh yeah, I don't know. Maybe that was a ventilation shaft or something sticking up. The interesting thing about the Yagan Brothers mine is they initially were able to control 480 acres and then later expanded their position to 800 acres. So they didn't have a lot of land to mine, 800 acres. And it was on both sides of the valley. And so sometime in the teens probably, they built a wooden trestle to get across the valley, and after they had mined everything they thought was mineable on the north side, they built a trestle across. Once upon a time I figured out where it was, but I can't remember exactly. Yeah, just right in there. Anyway,
across here or across that stream?
No, from the main mine tipple here, across the creek and up into this valley here. So, but the problem with that was by 1920 they were doing all their mining on the south side of the valley, and the trouble they ran into, and I think it was, let me just double check my notes so that I don't get this completely wrong. Yeah, October 1920, big windstorm, and the trestle went down, the whole trestle, and they never recovered from that. They didn't have the money to rebuild it, and without the trestle they couldn't get at the mine workings on the south side, and so the Yegan Brothers mining operation went bankrupt in November of 1921. They sold the mine to a company called Triangle Fuel, and Triangle Fuel did a little bit of mining through the late 20s, maybe into the 30s, but they weren't mining much, and after that the whole thing was abandoned. So probably late 20s, early 30s, the Bear Creek Coal Company mine here was done.
The mine maps show a dike as you get close to the mountain front of the salt dike that they just couldn't mine through. It was just too tough.
Oh, is that right?
They didn't have the right equipment or anything else. So some of the mines, the entries actually end at this dike.
Oh, do they?
Along the mountain front, which actually goes quite parallel for quite a ways.
Okay. Okay. The one thing I was to say, those other pictures, here's another person. I don't have that one picture. Here's another shot of this is the Yegan Brothers mining operation, just another view close up. All of this sitting right down here is kind of amazing. But on that hillside, if you remember, there was a picture I showed in my talk. They had this huge slack box. We're off on the east side of the thing, and you can see all of that's been recontoured and reclaimed. So it's kind of amazing. You would never know that this mining operation was tucked in this little hole here.
Early on, it appears in some of these prep plants that they didn't do a lot of washing. They just kind of crushed, maybe sized, and that was it.
Yeah.
But eventually, to compete, they had to start washing, getting rid of impurities and that sort of thing.
So I thought I'd talk just a minute about a little bit of geology. Why is this coal here? Of course, I talked about it. It's 60 to 55 million years ago, swamps and everything. It was a time called the Paleocene, and frame this up. The dinosaurs had just been wiped out by the meteor impact, and so one of the things, it was warmer. There was no ice at the poles at this time. The temperature was, what did I say here, about 20 degrees on average hotter than it is today, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was probably double what it is right now, and so plants loved it. So these swamps, these forests grew like crazy because of the abundance of CO2, the warmth, all of that stuff. And the other thing that I hadn't thought of before was that because the dinosaurs had been wiped out, it took a while before large herbivores evolved from the mammals. During the early Paleocene, there weren't any herds of buffalo or whatever was going to eat the plant matter roaming around. The animals that were living here then were all kind of small guys, and so that encouraged the plant growth too. There was nothing munching them up and doing away with it. So all of these things contributed to the Paleocene being a good time for coal to form, for the swamps, for the plants to grow, and all of that stuff. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, the coal here is significant But at the same time that this coal was being deposited here, you move east over into the Powder River Basin, and there was a ton more coal being, it's being mined off by Gillette now. That coal is the same age as the coal here. So these coal swamps were really nothing compared to what was over in Wyoming and eastern Montana at this time. It was, and I mean, those swamps persisted for millions of years in the same place, rotting, piling up piles of plant matter to turn into these coal
Apparently
beds.
subsidence kept taking place
Yeah.
along the mountainside.
Yeah, as the Beartooth Mountains were coming up, you had down warping back here and accommodation for the sediment to build up, so you could get huge thick sections building up in this area. Any questions? Those are my main points here.
Is that slack down there? Black?
Right down here on this side of the creek. So, is that it? Well, we'll just run up the road just a bit to the Smith Mine and hop over there and call it a day.
Cemetery, many years ago, Yellowstone Genealogy Forum walked all the cemeteries in this county, and we had not seen them interpret the headstones.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Well, a lot of the information is already on this board. You can read it at your leisure. I'll just make a few added comments. This, of course, is the Montana Coal and Iron Company's Smith Mine. They had mining operations scattered through here. This was their main one. This is where the explosion happened in 1943. And after that, most of their operations shifted over to that first place in Foster Gulch that I talked about. The Foster Mine was where most of the operations took place. This was another mine where, as I talked about the last stop, they had mined out the property on the north side of the valley. And this picture shows pretty clearly the trestle that they built. Again, just like at the Yagan Brothers mine, they had to build a trestle to get across the valley to get to their workings on the south side. And a lot of people don't realize that the explosion took place in the mine on the south side of the valley. It didn't happen over here. It happened over there. So, but that was pretty much the end of the road for this operation. Just to talk a little bit about what you're looking at, this would have been like the main office. This would be the entry road into the mining operation at the bottom of the hill. It's kind of like the mine office where you check in when you come to work. You can see the bench behind the big building on the right is the mine tipple. And you can see kind of a bench where the coal would have been hauled along a little rail line and tipped into the tipple there. It's an interesting operation here because they would accumulate the coal in the tipple and then use that long sloping conveyor you can see that runs from there up to the other building. And the other building is where the coal was washed and sorted. So it was one of these things where I guess they weren't. It gave them the flexibility that the sorting and washing operation wasn't linked directly to the mining operation. In other words, they could keep mining and fill the tipple up, and then when they wanted to, they would run the conveyor and process the coal as they needed to. And then at the bottom of that building where the conveyor goes up, you can still see some rusty bins, and that's where they would have been loading out the rail cars, and you can still see the remnants of the railroad cars. The other buildings that you see a little further behind the main sorting room are just like machine shops and workshops and all that stuff, storage buildings for that. The other thing you can see here, but you can't see from where we're standing, is there's a little bitty building up that gulch, and if you were to go a little further up the road where you could look up there, you'd see a couple of big steam boilers sitting there, and that was the boiler house. They used the boilers to generate electricity to operate the mine equipment in the mine. So the boiler house was up on the hill. There's the tipple and the sorting operation there. Yeah.
So is all this private property now, or is it any segment of it public property?
No, this is all owned by the Sunlight Ranches. It's a big operation out of Wyoming.
They agreed finally to let the nominating committee nominate this for the National Register under the stipulation that nobody would enter the property.
No,
so if you do, you're trespassing.
Yeah, and a lot of those buildings are, the best charitable thing you can say about them is they're in hazardous condition.
Yeah, right.
And there would be real concerns about, and I am told by people who grew up in Red Lodge that this was a major party site.
Yeah.
So there may have been additional damage inflicted over the years. So it's really not safe to go into most of those things.
And one of the buildings over there is a warehouse, and there's still little drawers that are still labeled with parts.
Have you been there?
For the mine, yeah, I've been in it, yeah.
We did a tour, which is video was available on site about 4 years ago.
Yeah, when the nominating committee was working, yeah.
So you can see some of the interior, and there were several people who were narrating as we went through the parts there, and I believe that's available from the museum website.
Okay, so this was a big disaster, but I'm assuming this was dangerous work, and there was a lot of things, a lot of smaller accidents. And
when you
roof falls.
when you follow the newspaper accounts, and it's like hardly a month goes by that there isn't something in the newspaper about somebody losing a finger or losing a hand or losing their life.
It was the miner's fault.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't the company, it was the miner's fault.
Yeah. But coal mining was a dangerous business.
And a lot of black lung disease and stuff like this back east, or did it not last long enough?
I suppose there were cases of it. I haven't seen any.
Yeah, I don't know. I assume, coal dust is coal dust.
My grandfather had black lung, but because he owned his own mine, he didn't qualify for a long time. Took a lot of legal fighting before he got black lung benefit.
So the only thing I'll add, I usually have another stop, but it's probably not worth the trouble. But if you're heading back to Red Lodge from here, you can follow the railroad's roadbed. Is pretty clear on the side of the hill as you go up. If you look off to the right, you'll see the roadbed and you'll see some cuts. And the railroad ran up to Washoe, and there was one more mine, which was the mine that Anaconda Copper Company operated up at the high end of the valley. So there's one little brick building which I think was where they stored their dynamite and explosives and stuff, but I don't think there's not much else other than some foundations that are kind of hidden in the grass up there. But, the Anaconda mine, let me see, what did I say here? I don't say anything. Anyway, I think it pretty much shut down during the 1930s as well.
So any stories about big fires? Normally a lot of these early communities, they burn down more than once.
This mine had a lot of fire problems, and the mining company, the Montana Coal and Iron Company, attributed them to the miners. The tipple burned down 2 or 3 times during the course of operations here, and the company always attributed it to the miners, who are always pissed off at the company. So I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not.
Did unions play a big role here?
Well, there were a lot of strikes. Yeah.
Well, the building you were in for the lecture part was the original UMW
Labor Temple.
It was the Labor Temple. It was called the Labor Temple. It's built in
1909. If you go around town in an antique shop and you see miners' paychecks that have been framed, things from the Montana Coal and Iron Company, they were stolen out of the office building right down there. Somebody went in, because the floor was littered with the records. They were never removed. So
maybe more than one person went in there and stole volumes of documents and had framed them and has sold them around town as artifacts. You know.
So that's basically it. Like I say, the railroad ran up to Washoe, and that was the dead end, and the final mine in the valley. You know, the one thing that's interesting from a geological standpoint is, you know, I talked about there's 9 coal beds, and the rocks are basically flat, and so the further up the valley you go, the higher in the stratigraphic section you are. And when you're at Washoe, the initial entry into the mine up there was in coal bed number 1. And as you came down the valley, progressively, like the Smith mine here, the initial entry was in coal bed number 3. And as you walk further down the valley and you get down to the International mine, which I talked about at the other stop, their initial entry was in coal bed number 5. So it's sort of interesting to me, just the topography dictated which coal bed. Now after they'd go into whatever the initial bed was, if they mined it out or whatever, they could put in a sloping shaft to connect it to the next lower or upper bed, so they might mine more than one coal bed out of there. But that progression from coal bed number 1 to coal bed number 5 is documented by the sequence of beds that they entered
That's
in each
before
mine.
the convention was adopted, that's used now by every stratigrapher. The bottom coal is labeled 1, and the upper ones are 6. At that time, they did it the other way around. 1 was the top, and 6 or 7 was the bottom. So.
I have a question that may be obvious. There was never a railroad between Bear Creek and Red Lodge. Was that because it was impossible or too expensive?
Well, not impossible, nothing's impossible, right? But it was really impractical. They initially, when they first started developing the mines here, the Northern Pacific looked real hard at building a railroad because they were already in Red Lodge. But one of the big things, I mean, that's a steep grade. You'd need a lot, you don't want to exceed 3% on a railroad grade, and it would have taken a lot of track to get up and over. But then the bigger problem is, you got loaded cars on this side, you got to go back up that hill. And so it just
and then you have to go down the other side.
And down the other side. So I mean, yeah, they studied it pretty hard, and there was talk about doing it, but it really wasn't the practical way to do it. Phil Gallaher, the guy that I talked about, inserted himself into Northern Pacific's discussions numerous times, saying, you know, you guys are crazy. You got to come up to Clark's Fork. You can't do that, you know. And they figured that out eventually.
And no tunnel was ever an option?
No, no one ever.
Digging through the mines.
Yeah. So yeah, a tunnel would have been pretty expensive to try to bore through there too.
So if you go across the creek in Red Lodge, the development's called Island at Rock Creek, 13th Street Bridge. You're looking at some of the old east side mine buildings. Those were the entrances, and there's a fan house and something else
right,
out there.
There's a fan housing up there.
There used to be the power generating station down there at the end of Island of Rock Creek. There's a kind of a dirt zigzag onto the next city street, and right there is where the power station was. It was an Edison power station built, I think, in 1893.
Yeah,
Very early.
Really early. Yeah.
And it supplied power to town up into the 1920s, and was still functioning when they shut down the mines. But by the 1920s, most of the power was coming out of Montana Power and their dams over at Mystic Lake. But here, you know, they would have power plants generate power for the mines, and then when they weren't using it, or if they had surplus, or just generally, they'd run the wires into the towns. And so all the towns here were electrified from the early 1900s.
And that building was torn down, the power plant was torn down when the island at Rock Creek was created.
Yes.
In many lawsuits.
Well, what's the big cement building that's still there? I always thought
That's
was
breastwork from the chromite mill.
Well, I know the one way up, but how about the one close to their pond?
Well, that pond is discharge water out of the number 3 slope.
Right, I know that. I'm talking about the cement building near the pond.
Right. That was the fan housing. To go in there, you'll see where I think the fan is still there. ventilated the mine.
Okay.
They're getting touchy about people going
Yeah,
off into
right.
the hillsides
It's
there.
definitely a attractive nuisance. I'm surprised somebody hasn't been hurt there. But the pond, they had to do something with the water coming out the number 3 shaft. So they hired a hydraulic engineer, and he said, well, why don't we just have a pond here? And the water wasn't really that good, but as he said, a judge said the water was just fine. So once the judge says the water's fine, the water's fine. So, but you'll notice there's scum and everything that forms on that
And
pond.
the same sulfurous odor.
Yeah, right. So it's really not very good water.
Well, thank you all. That's it.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. You bet. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Okay.